The West has funded extremist groups and bankrolled wars across the Middle East for a century. These groups have toppled governments, sparked revolutions, and wreaked havoc wherever they went. In 2001, we reaped what we had sowed. Let's take a look at the secret history of Western interference in the Middle East. Part 1. Divide and Conquer. The British Army was overstretched. Naval power and a modern military had allowed Britain to control a quarter of the world's population and landmass, but the Brits were outnumbered by their subjects. Their army was stretched thin. Rebellions were common and difficult to manage. Following in the footsteps of the Romans, the British implemented a divide and conquer policy. You might be wondering what this has got to do with the Middle East, or the Taliban for that matter, but we'll get to that shortly. I promise you, it's all related. So India was the testing ground for proxy wars and covert operations, and it goes back further than you'd think. The British conquered India by siding with the Mughals, who were the minority Muslim leaders who controlled large swathes of the subcontinent. But following a nationalist rebellion of the British conquest in 1857, the British stopped their efforts to proselytise the locals, which was upsetting the nationalists, and began to drum up the tensions between the Hindu majority and the Islamic minority. The aim was to stop the natives forming a common Indian identity, and it was strikingly successful. Decades of religious conflict was an effective distraction from the British administration. The jewel of the British Empire was safe, for now. In Egypt, 1928, a far more threatening movement was growing, and the British would follow the example they set in India. A schoolteacher by the name of Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was an Islamist movement with the self-stated aim of the establishment of a state ruled by Sharia law. The group worried the colonial masters, but they saw an opportunity. The Brotherhood was a pan-Islamic movement and was opposed to Arab nationalism, a potent force at the time. The Brotherhood believed all Arabs were one and saw national borders and national identities as an obstacle to religious unity. Britain was keen to keep control of Egypt, which they valued for the Suez Canal, which was a vital trade link for the empire as it collected the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. In fact, as a side note, British support for Jewish migration to neighbouring Israel was partly to provide a reliable client population in a strategically important location, and to keep the French, who controlled neighbouring Syria, out of a territory bordering the canal. Although it must be noted, support for the Jews in Palestine was not strictly strategic. It was also a religious matter, with great support from the West as a matter of principle. Even Western leaders supported the project, such as Churchill, who was a lifelong Zionist. Anyway, back to Egypt. The British officially supported the monarch, King Farouk, and initially tried to suppress the Brotherhood, but sensing a shift in political power, King Farouk started to secretly fund the Brotherhood, which was growing in popularity. He did this despite their anti-British sentiment. The monarch did this for good reason. He used the Brotherhood to counter the growing secular, nationalist movement seeking democracy within his kingdom. They would also prove useful against the communists, who also sought to overthrow him. It wasn't long before the British followed suit, albeit reluctantly. The British became convinced that the Brotherhood would be a valuable ally against the growing communist threat. Of course, the Brotherhood's creed was anti-democratic and sought a theocracy, but that was less of an immediate threat to the future of Britain than communism, and it posed little appeal outside the Muslim world. So, in 1941, the British offered to fund the Brotherhood in exchange for a degree of support, or at least less hostility towards the British. It was an uneasy alliance for both sides, but the Brotherhood got funding it desperately needed, and the West got a bulwark against popular nationalist and communist movements. But by the end of the Second World War, British influence had faded, and the Americans began to lead foreign policy in the Middle East. The British, sensing their decline, co-opted a special relationship with the Americans, who had shared interests in the Middle East. Part 2. Oil. Let's go back to the opening years of the 20th century. This was when the West, and the rest of the world, realised that the future of power would depend on controlling oil reserves and production. The fall of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the European powers to seize. Ottoman territories included the largest producers of oil, including modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, parts of what is now Saudi Arabia. The power vacuum left behind by the Turks left these locations ripe for the taking. The collapse of the Turkish Caliphate roused Muslim groups across former Ottoman lands. The Arabs had endured centuries of subjugation under the Turks, and the British promised the Arabs that in exchange for an alliance, they could regain their autonomy. The Arabian people were promised that they would reclaim their rightful place as the rulers of the Muslim world in exchange for their loyalty. To sweeten the deal, the British promised them control of Mecca and Medina, the holiest sites in Islam, as well as eventual independence. Of course, when striking the deal, the Brits had their eye on one thing: oil. Nonetheless, the Arabs took the deal and revolted with the support and funding of the British, and took back control of much of the Middle East, along with the vast oil reserves that it possessed, which at this point produced most of the world's oil. As a result, British and American firms gained control of the oil fields and won the contracts for production in these areas, with the West taking huge profit as well as control of a critical resource. But by the 1950s, the situation in the Middle East was not looking good for European and American interests. Revolution hit Egypt in 1952. A secular nationalist government seeking democracy ended up taking power, overthrowing the British-backed monarch in 1958. The government nationalised the Suez Canal, which was owned by the French and the British, taking away a vital trade link from the empires. Things were looking good for the people of Egypt, if you have a liberally minded outlook. Democracy, nationalised infrastructure, and separation of church and state. Well, Britain and France didn't take too kindly to this, and when Egypt took control of the Suez Canal, they also banned Israeli ships from travelling through it. In response, Britain, France and Israel joined a secret pact. Technically, the nationalist leader, Nasser, was in breach of international law by nationalising the canal, so the three nations invaded, sparking the Suez crisis. It took a UN resolution for the tripartite to withdraw. The three countries defeated now had a taste of what was to come. If nationalist forces could take away assets as valuable as the Suez Canal, what could happen in the oil-producing nations? A cease in oil supplies would in effect turn off the lights in the West. France, Britain, Germany and the USA were not self-sufficient in oil at this time. The risk of economic collapse as a result of an oil embargo was at the forefront of foreign policy. The nationalists had to be stopped. Nasser's actions in Suez were hugely popular across the Middle East. The path forward was clear: to keep the Middle East divided. The very next year, in 1957, a rebellion was launched against the repressive Sultan in Oman. Britain had learned from their failed invasion of Egypt in 1956 and acted quickly, intervening on behalf of the Sultan, crushing the rebellion. Then the very next year in 1958, British troops were deployed to Jordan and the US sent troops to Lebanon, both for the same reason: to stave off any nationalist rebellions buoyed by Egypt's victory and prevent the same thing happening in Iraq. The interests of Britain and the USA were finally aligned. Neither could afford to be cut off from Middle East oil, but the presence of foreign troops roused nationalist support and was not sustainable across the entire Middle East. So the two nations worked to stem the spread of secular nationalism by working with the region's most conservative state, Saudi Arabia. Part 3. Funding the extremists. King Saud and other local monarchs were frightened by the popularity of the secular, democratic nationalist movements. They had already taken Egypt and had sparked revolutions and rebellions on their doorstep. Britain and the USA saw their first success against the secular nationalists in 1953 in Iran. Following the proposed nationalisation of Iranian oil reserves, the US and Britain, sensing danger to their purse strings, funded Islamic tribes and guerrilla fighters as part of Operation Boot. The coalition of tribes overthrew the democratically elected leader and installed a somewhat friendlier Islamic theocracy in its place. Finally tasting victory, the two nations looked to Saudi Arabia. When the nationalist Nasser took power in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood were kicked out. Many of their leaders found refuge in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family saw nationalism as a threat to their continued rule. They too, under the guidance of the USA, saw the Brotherhood as a counterforce against the secularists. However, even though the Saudis gave the Brotherhood refuge and allowed them to continue their work against Egypt, Sudan and other countries, they would not allow the Brotherhood to spread their message within the kingdom. They recognised the power that the movement had. The US continued to throw money at King Saud, who used the cash to fund terrorist cells across the region. The money was also used to spread the Wahhabi fundamentalist creed, declared by the European Parliament in 2013 as the main source of global terrorism. With US backing, US funding and oil money, the Saudis financed mosques and Islamic associations across the globe practicing the creed. The Muslim Brotherhood operated from the mosques and institutions funded by King Saud, spreading Islamist messages throughout the Middle East. The aim, the establishment of religious Sharia law and the installation of theocracy. The speed and success of the operation was outstanding. If the West had knew the true cost of supporting these regimes, they would have probably reconsidered. Part 4. The modern way. The death of the secular nationalist leader Nasser in 1970 changed Egypt's political landscape. His replacement rid the government of nationalists and sought to re-Islamicize Egyptian society, all done with the aim of wooing the US to gain financial and political support. By the 1980s, the threat of Arab nationalism had faded and was being replaced by a growing communist threat. The Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan in 1979, striking fear into the Islamic monarchs and bolstering a wave of communist support amongst the Arab people. But the Islamist groups being funded across the Middle East were effective. Around this time, the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi took in a young Afghan scholar by the name of Osama bin Laden. Here he was taught by a leading Palestinian scholar, Abdullah Azzam. Azzam preached jihad against the Soviets and the Western colonial powers. The West backed the Mujahideen against the communists in Afghanistan, despite their Islamist vision. Following a long protracted war, the West had successfully defeated the nationalists and now had a bulwark against the communist threat. America and Saudi funded the Mujahideen jihad against the Soviet Union and pushed them out of the country. Although in the end, infighting amongst the Mujahideen left them weak after their victory, and they were quickly replaced by the Taliban, another Islamist group originating in the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The movement was funded by Saudi money and Saudi preachers who supported the religious seminaries. Now the fundamentalists and Islamists have a foothold across the world, with rich donors in the Gulf states who fund the teaching of their ideas across the Middle East and Europe. Over the years, the West has suffered numerous bombings and terrible catastrophes as a result of the expansion of these extremist networks. Also, it's true that the capabilities of groups such as ISIS abroad have declined, their ideology is widespread, taught across the globe, with propaganda outfits inspiring lone agents to commit atrocities wherever they stand. The extremists' ideas are here to stay, and it's Western collusion that put them on the map. And if you're still here, please remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel.